The Life, Travels, and Books of Alexander von Humboldt by Stoddard, Richard Henry. Chapter 1. Childhood and Youth. 3 leagues from the good city of Berlin, near an arm of Havel called Tegel, stands or stood 90 years ago the old castle of Tegel. Behind it lay a grove of dark pines which separated it from the capital. On the southern shore of the lake were the town and fortress of Spandau, and to the northwest grassy and wooded declivities, studded with promenades and gardens. Doubtless this castle, gray and antiquated, had a stirring history of its own in the days of old, but of this tradition is silent. All that we know is that shortly before the opening of this life history, it was the residence of a Prussian commissioner of woods and forests, who had greatly beautified it by the laying out of nurseries and plantations. This commissioner, whose name was von Bergsdorf, was succeeded in 1768 or thereabouts by Major Alexander George von Humboldt. Major von Humboldt was born in 1720. His father, Hans Paul von Humboldt, served as a captain in the army of Frederick William I. His mother was the daughter of the Prussian major and the general adjutant von Schweider. It was natural before that he should follow the profession of arms. He served for a long time in the dragoon regiment, and then was made major, and finally adjunct to Duke Frederick of Brunswick, who often sent him on embassies to Frederick the Great. This was in the famous 7 Years' War. When the war was over in 1765, the great Frederick made him one of his chamberlains. He was also attendant chamberlain on Elizabeth, the newly married Princess of Prussia. His official duties compelled him to reside in Potsdam, where he probably met the lady who became his wife, a descendant of the family Colomb, which emigrated from Burgundy, where it is celebrated for its glass works. She was the widow of a Baron von Hollweed. Major von Humboldt persuaded her to change her weeds for the orange wreath. So they married and settled in Potsdam. Their first child, William, was born there on the 22nd of June, 1767. They lived in Potsdam but a short time, 2 or 3 years at most, for the marriage of the princess being at length dissolved. She had no further need of an attendant chamberlain. Consequently, Major von Humboldt was at liberty to change his residence if so inclined. He exchanged Potsdam for Berlin, and lived partly there and partly in the castle at Tegel. How he became possessed of the castle is not stated. It was originally a hunting seat of the great elector, and a hunting establishment was kept up there under Frederick the Great. The major's second son, Frederick Henry Alexander, was born at Berlin on the 14th of September, 1769. It was principally at Tegel, however, that his childhood passed. Of the first years of his life, nothing remarkable has been related. This is the sameness in the lives of children, no matter what their rank or talents. If they happen to become famous in after years, admiring and credulous biographers tell wonderful stories about them, but for the most part, these stories are mythic. are myths. The infancy of the great we think should be surrounded with marvelous influences. It will never do for us to make them common mortals like ourselves. So if we fail to discover any traits of early divinity, we must boldly invent them. Should the cheat be discovered, the world will forgive it, for the sake of pleasure it has given them. That the child of Alexander, however, was an exceedingly happy one cannot be doubted, for if ever nature was kindly disposed towards any of her children, it was towards him. He was born of wealthy and noble parents, who mingled by virtue their rank and worth with the most illustrious of the land. His home, the old castle of Teagle, situated in the pleasant country, was surrounded by charming and varied landscapes. His earliest glimpse of nature was beautiful enough to make him desire to see the rest of the book. It was a fair page that opened before his childish eyes, and here, if the reader is imaginative, he can employ himself in filling up the outlines of the first 5 or 6 years of Alexander's life. We may picture him in the chambers of the old castle, climbing up to his father's knee, and wondering if as he runs through his fingers through his gray hair, what the wrinkles on his forehead mean, or tugging at the gown of his mother to make her answer some unanswerable question, or likelier still, scrambling on the floor with his brother William and a heap of toys. Some day, when playing alone, he sees the bookcase in the corner, and remembering as if in a dream the pictures with which the nurse pacified him when he was sick, he goes to it and, opening the door softly, lights be a sort of impish instinct on the costliest volume on the shelves. It is some famous work on natural history, a ponderous quarto filled with colored prints of strange plants and animals, and still stranger men. He pores over them with great eyes, fearing at last that he is in mischief, for he has heard nothing of him for a long time. His mother steals into his room and finds him fast asleep with the book in his lap. As he grows older, he takes himself out of doors on all possible occasions. Now he is in the garden, plucking and studying flowers and grasses. Now in the pine grove, filling his pockets with last year's cones and needles. And now by the edge of the lake, skimming pebbles over its surface, or watching its fleet of mirrored clouds. In such wise, says fancy, who is sometimes truer than fact, lived the boy Alexander until 1775, when his education commenced. The science of education, a science which is still in its infancy, the opinion of its professors to the contrary notwithstanding, was at least at this time agitating to the European world the new method of Rousseau, which aimed at the physical as well as the mental development of its pupils, and which considered the study of natural science full as important as that of metaphysics and the classics, had made many adherents in Germany, and among others Joachim Heinrich Camp, born in 1746. Camp studied theology at Helmstadt and at Halle, and was appointed in 1773 chaplain to the Prince of Prussia's regiment in Potsdam. He fulfilled for 2 years the duties of his sacred calling in that doubtful sphere of action, and feeling himself much more fitted to teach children than men. And those soldiers, he was transplanted by Major von Humboldt to teach his sons at the old castle of Teagle. A ripe and varied scholar even then, he enjoyed afterlife the reputation of being, next to Comstock, the greatest philologist and critic of German style. He is the author of a German dictionary and other works calculated to improve the language, but the books by which he is best known are those of travel and adventure. The chiefest of these are his Discovery of America and Robinson Crusoe. Looking back from the vantage ground of time and bearing in mind what Alexander von Humboldt has done, what might have seemed a trivial thing then, a mere lucky chance, now seems the special ordering of nature. He was fitted, we have since learned, to perform a great work for her. But before he could perform that work, it was necessary that she should reveal it to him. If the child is to become the father of man, the man must somehow be brought before the mental eye of the child. His infancy must be nurtured by noble books and wise teachers, or, quote, by Solomon vision and bright silver dream, end quote. What better teacher could the boy have had, considering the work he was to do, that one who translated that marvelous fiction of the homely old truther Defoe, the fresh, unfading, world-renowned Robinson Crusoe? It was the book of all others to fire his youthful imagination with the desire of travel, and to fill his mind with the unconquerable spirit of adventure. It was a happy day when Joachim Heimerkamp, philologist, critic, translator, and finally bookseller, became the tutor of Humboldt. He remained in the family a year, teaching the eldest boy the languages and the youngest, who was then in his 7th year, whatever he was pleased to learn. Alexander was not so robust as his brother, for his health was considered delicate for many years, nor was he regarded as his equal in mental endowments. Their tutor was a young man of 20, poor in this world's goods, but rich in what the proverb declares to be better than houses and lands, learning. His name was Christian Kunth. He is said to have possessed an extraordinary knowledge of German, Latin, and French literature, and to have been deeply read in philosophy and history. He taught William the languages and Alexander the natural sciences. One studied man in classic antiquity and art, the other the world and its manifold forms and appearances. It seems strange, not to say impossible, for the children of 8 and 10 to pursue such profound studies, but we must remember that they were not common children, nor was their teacher Kunth a common man. Had he been, he would have stopped there, but having sense as well as learning, he took care of their bodies as well as their minds, instead of merely cramming them with books until they became unwholesome monstrosities, mental pâté de foie gras. He gave their thoughts and limbs free play in the wind and dew and sunshine. They had holidays whenever they needed them, long walks with Kunth in the woods and fields, sails on the blue bosom of Tegel Lake, excursions to the fortress of Spandau, and now and then a flying visit to Berlin, or they threw aside their books and ran off by themselves like the children they were, and romped and played to their heart's content. This kept the roses of health in their cheeks. Alexander's as yet were delicate buds, and enabled them to, quote, bear their weight of learning lightly, like a flower, end quote. Before this, it might have been a nightshade of deadly power, Besides, their life was diversified by coming and going of visitors, for their father was hospitable, and the castle was always open to his friends. Retiring from the world with honor, the world sought him in the shape of its princes, statesmen, and scholars, to say nothing of generals, colonels, and the like, his old companions in arms. Among other celebrities who enjoyed the hospitalities of Tegel was Goethe, who, accompanying Duke Karl August to Berlin in May 1778 to see a grand review, strolled over Schönhausen one morning and dined at the castle with the major and his family. Little did the man know that he was in the boy of 9, one who was destined to accomplish as much in science as he himself in literature. But the time came when he knew him and admired him none more warmly. Among the most frequent of the visitors at the castle was Dr. Ernst Ludwig Heim of Spandau, who, having attended the now officially defunct head ranger von Bernstorff, continued his visits, medical and friendly, to his successor, Major von Humboldt, and the major stood in need of his services, for his health, which had been broken for some time, now began to fail rapidly. Day after day, Dr. Heim might have been seen on horseback, with saddlebags full of medicine, rounding the stretch of land between Spandau and Tegel. But he could do little for the shattered constitution in the 60 years of his patients. He died in January 1779 and was buried at Tegel. After the major's death, Dr. Heim continued to come as usual, not now bringing medicine, let us hope, but with a book under his arm for Couth, or possibly for William and Alexander, or perhaps it was a rare flower for his conservatory. For as long as the days von Bernstorff, he was noted for his knowledge of foreign trees and plants, and he helped the head ranger to lay out the nurseries and plantations which the Humboldts were now enjoying. He would drop in near the dinner hour, and being pressed would remain to dinner, and often for hours after, instructing the boys in botany and explaining to them the 24 classes of the system of Linnaeus. They would now know the names, classes, and characteristics of the flowers, which they had admired ignorantly. William was considered the cleverest because he could easily comprehend the doctor's lessons and retain the botanical names. Alexander was not, or it did not seem so apt. The brothers, with the doctor and his excursions about the neighborhood, and in 1783 were present with him in Spandau, where they saw Frederick the Great reviewing his grenadiers, one of his annual amusements. But grand reviews, country excursions, after-dinner chats on botany, and the cozy comforts of home must soon come to an end. For though the widowed mother lives only in her children, she knows that they must one day be men and go out in the world. So the best thing they can do is go to Berlin and pursue their studies and enlarge their experiences. To Berlin they must go. They were instructed in Greek and the modern languages, William having great philological talent, while Alexander, whose love of natural sciences grows with his growth, continues the study of botany, under the celebrated botanist Wildenau. Kunth, who accompanies them, engages Engel, Klein, and Don, and others, to give them complete courses of lectures on philosophy, law, and political economy. Nor do they neglect the literature of their own land and time. They read Goethe and Schiller together. William prefers Werther and Don Carlos and their art writings. Alexander, while he admires those who prefer Goethe's more abstruse researches in natural history, so passes the time, and now in the bustle of the capital, and now in the quiet of the old castle at home. Dear old Teagle, it is doubly dear to them now, for their mother lives, and there lies their dead father's dust. In 1786, they commenced their academical life in the University of Frankfurt on the Oder, where they remained nearly 2 years, William devoting himself to the study of law and Alexander to political economy. In 1788, they were moved to the University of Göttingen. The name of this university will remind the reader of English comic poetry of Canning's famous song in burlesque drama, The Rovers. Quote, Werner with haggard eye I view this dungeon that I'm rotting in. I think of those companions true who studied with me at the University of Göttingen. End quote. The stanzas are quizzical enough, but the university itself was a staid, grave place full of earnest students and learned professors. Among the latter, we may mention 3 who were celebrated in different branches of literature and science, and who helped to mold those minds of William and Alexander. Those were Blumenbach, Heine, and Einhorn. Einhorn, the professor of Arabic, was a profound scholar, especially in biblical literature, of which he may be considered the historian. He filled the chair of theology. In the chair of archaeology sat Christian Gottlob Heine, a venerable man of 60, who had risen above the lowest of circumstances by the force of his will and his talents. His specialty was classical bibliography. He edited Homer, Pindar, Didacus, Sticulus, Epictetus, Virgil, Tibullus, and other Greek and Roman authors, great and small, enriching their text with learned commentaries. When the Humboldts became his scholars, he was busy making out a catalog of the immense library of the university. Last was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, professor at physiology and comparative anatomy, passionately attached to his science all his life, which, by the way, was nearly as long as his famous pupil Humboldt. His love of anatomy commenced at the early age of 10, from accidentally seeing a skeleton in the house of one of his father's friends, a physician, of course. He soon had a collection of bones and skulls of his own, and talking to medicine in Jena, obtained his degree in Göttingen in 1775. The next year he was appointed conservator of the Noble Museum of Natural History in the university, which he enriched by numerous collections of great value. He preceded Cuvier in many of his discoveries, instituting shortly before the Humboldts entered his classes the method of comparing different varieties of human skeletons and skeletons of animals. To the care of these famous professors, William and Alexander were committed by their old tutor and friend Kunth, and they remained under their teaching for 2 years. Strongly attracted by Einhorn and Heine, William pursued his favorite studies, philosophy and art, while Alexander speculated on the ground plan of man. in the lecture hall room of Blumenbach. But the person who exercised the most influence over him while at Göttingen was the son-in-law of his teacher, Hein George Forster. Nor is this at all strange, for the experience of every day shows us that the influence of man over and over outweighs that of books 1,000-fold. There are times, indeed, when even a bad man is more important than many good books. Blumenbach, Hein, Einhorn, and the rest, excellent and indispensable as they were books, so to speak, dead books to the realistic Alexander, while Forster was a man, a live man. He had seen what they had only dreamed of. The feats of Alexander's mythical friend Crusoe were outdone by Forster. Not that Forster had ever been shipwrecked on a solitary island, but he had done better. He had put a girdle round the earth some 16 years before with a boy of 18. He had accompanied Captain Cook as a naturalist in the great navigator's second voyage around the world. Afterwards, the professor of natural history in Hesse Castle and at Wilna. He was now spending the summer with his wife at the house of his father-in-law, Hein. He had written several works on natural history and geography and philosophy and politics. Besides a history of his voyage round the world, writing of Forster in 1844, more than 50 years after his death, Humboldt paid the following tribute to his memory. Quote, "Through him began a new era of scientific voyages, the aim of which was to arrive at knowledge of the comparative history and geography of different countries, gifted with the delicate and aesthetic feelings and retaining a vivid impression of the pictures with which Tahiti and the other happy islands of the Pacific had filled his imagination, and in recent times that of Charles Darwin. George Forster was the first to depict in pleasing colors the changing stages of vegetation, the relations of climate and of articles of food, and their influence on the organization of mankind, according to the differences of original descent and habitation. All that give truth individually and distinctiveness to the delineation of exotic nature and united in his works. We trace not only in his admirable description of Cook's second voyage of discovery, but still more to his smaller writings, the germ of the richer fruit which has since matured." End quote. Such was the George Forster who, after camp, was the chief instrument in determining the future life of Alexander von Humboldt. They were fast friends during the short period of their intercourse in Göttingen, and all that time they could spare from their customary duties was spent in each other's society. What conversations they must have had the eventual journey round the world, and what schemes they planned for their future. The active imagination of the young student, fresh from the reading of wonderful adventures in the New World, the chronicles of Vasco Nuez de Balboa, Pizarro, and the rest of those grand old Spaniards, was fired with the thought of making new voyages and discoveries, which should cast out the old ones forever in shade. Voyages in the long swell of tropic seas under the constellations that never shine to European eyes. Sailing along the dim outlines of the western continent, dark with the long belt of pathless forests, or ragged with the peaks of inland mountains, capped with eternal snow, or up great rivers 1,000 leagues in length, on into the heart of the New World, the primeval studies of nature. The best hours of a man's life are those he wastes in those dreams, and happy is he who can make them true as Humboldt did. But this was recreation rather than study, and as he went to the university to study, a graver mood soon succeeded. The university was rich in scientific collections, none of which neglected by the earnest young students, which not attending the lectures by Blumenbach and Heine, which were generally given in their own houses. He persuaded his researches and experiments in the University Museum, today in the laboratory among its vials and crucibles testing acids and gases, or in the botanic gardens theorizing over tropic plants and trees, tomorrow in the anatomical room surrounded by casts and models, and many a long night in the observatory unwinding the dances of the stars. William, meanwhile, was deep in the philosophy of Kant and the aesthetic speculations of Goethe and Schiller. Occasionally the brothers strolled through the city arm in arm, led on by their vagrant fancies. They would cross into the marketplace, to which the fountain splashing in its broad basin lounge on the bridge and look at the stars below. Or quickening their steps, they would hasten to the ramparts and saunter up and down the shaded avenue of lime trees. If the day was beautiful, they wandered out in the city gates into the fertile valleys below, and perhaps clomb the Hainberg before they returned. So passed their university life. It ended in the autumn of 1789. It is to be regretted that we have no further account of the youth of Humboldt, for if there is anything interesting in this life of a great man like him, it is a minute revelation of his youth, and the ductile period of his genius. Even his sports, if we can cover nothing better, will give us some insight into his character. We have presented, as the reader will perceive, the mere skeleton of the first 20 years of Humboldt's life. He may clothe it with flesh if he pleases. He can do no more, nor can others at this day. It is easy to write the biographies of those who die young. They leave so many behind who can recollect all that we desire to know. But when a man of genius lives to the age of 90, as Humboldt did, and leaves no autobiography, the sweetest time of his life is lost. Quote, in the dark, backward, and abysm of time. Unquote.